AI in biopharma has been a thing for like 7 to 8 years.
It was called bioinformatics.
Yeah, of course, fair point, like 20, 30 years ago, AI was a thing, but it was called bioinformatics, and then data science, and then AI. What we are currently showing in the current partnerships and what our focus for the next 18 months is to demonstrate simulations in a variety of different use cases and show that the same underlying technology, the same underlying model of cellular biology can be applied across all of these different problems.
I mean, you're living here in Budapest, and I see that you're traveling a lot to European hubs, either Boston. How do you prioritize all of this traveling?
I don't think we've proven that it can work like this, that you don't have to move to the UK or to Boston to build a successful AI and biotech company. I think we're putting in a good case.
Bienvenue to a new episode. I'm your host Philip, and on this show I'm interviewing the best Europeans in biotech to help you grow. AI is changing the world, including the biotech world, but it's hard to know what's hype and what's real. One of the best startups in Europe in this space is Turbine. So I went to Budapest to meet with founder Szabi, who I've known actually since 2017 when they joined the accelerator here in Berlin. We talked about AI in biotech at large. We also talked about opening up the platform versus keeping it closed for proprietary drug development, as well as building the company in Central Europe. For transparency, this episode has been sponsored by Turbine. So here's my conversation with Szabi, and please hit the like, follow button if you're enjoying it. Welcome to the show, Szabi.
Thanks for having me on, Philip. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Very excited to do this discussion, and I want to start with, say, the hype around AI for drug development. And as you are really active in the space, I'm wondering what's your take on it?
Yeah, who better to criticize the field than somebody that actually is part of the field? I'll go ahead and do that. Well, definitely, I think I'm not saying anything new when I say that AI is for sure overhyped. And it has been overhyped for years, right? I think actually we're getting to like the moment of truth for a lot of the leaders of the space, who are, of course, many of them are in clinical trials with drugs that they used AI to help develop and design. And of course, we're learning more about, some claims that were bogus when somebody said, yeah, sure, we'll, just markedly improve the success rates of clinical trials by designing better molecules using AI. Clearly, that's not necessarily going to happen. Using AI for some use cases has been impactful and is already standard practice across biopharma, but it hasn't, changed medicine yet. I mean, these technologies haven't changed medicine. And likely we didn't do ourselves a service in the field by overhyping the whole thing. However, I do think that, below the hype, the standard of practice, as I said, like the day-to-day life of drug discovery scientists has been shifting and have been shifting. So I think that's cool to see, actually.
And how much do you think the hype comes from the AI drug discovery company, drug development companies versus the whole AI in general? I mean, the whole ChatGPT and everything that there was a moment, and
sure, they surely
traction.
Surely feed off each other.
The fit there.
Yeah, because if you think about it, I mean, of course, AI in biopharma has been a thing for like maybe 7 to 8 years, really, when companies like
informatics.
Yeah, but of course, fair point, like 20, 30 years ago, AI was a thing, but it was called bioinformatics, and then data science, and then AI. But I think like mid-2010s, of course, companies like, clearly Recursion, Accenture, Atomwise, these guys have started raising their first major rounds. And so, people started paying attention. Even Y Combinator started paying attention to, Y Combinator, of course, the epitome of, technology and, sort of West Coast bullyism, of course, bullishness, yeah, on technology. Even they started paying attention. And so the hype started growing around AI and biotech around then. But now with ChatGPT around, suddenly everybody, of course, is a generative AI company, even the companies that have been around for 10 years and had nothing to do with the technology. So, clearly there's a sort of a back and forth sort of cycling of ideas, it's fine because clearly we're one of the areas, as in, AI in biopharma is one of the areas where really we're largely reusing technological progress in other application areas of AI to our own use cases, and we're learning how to deal with the specialty nature of the data that we train to, and the problems that we're trying to predict on, which of course is very difficult. So there's plenty of novel AI being done in biopharma, but really we're learning from other fields, and of course they have an impact on the hype cycle.
Yeah, that's correct. And maybe to stay on the hype cycle as well. I mean, you mentioned Recursion, Exscientia, they did a merger, but I think at the market cap for Exscientia that was lower than everything they raised, which at least if I look at it from an observer point of view is a sign that the valuation were too high before, or they were higher before. I think Benevolent AI also didn't work that well. What do you like? What's your take on those recent setback? Was it just a correction?
Yeah.
Was it set to then?
If you think about it, two things compounded in the valuations of a lot of the front runners of our field. One was the general crazy overheating of the biotech stocks. And of course, many of these companies really are ultimately biotech companies, and that's also how they want to position themselves. They develop pipelines of drugs, and they hope to be valued as a biotech company. So there was that sort of boost, as we know, sort of around until the end of 21. Of course, everybody was inflated, or everybody's price was inflated, but that was, I think, further compounded by the fact that, of course, many of us were also looked at, I think almost everybody was looked at as also like a tech company. And so a lot of us front runners got investments from tech investors, which priced us very differently than more traditional biotech investors usually do, the platforms that they invest into. And so those two effects combined and really drove the valuation. Recursion was 8 billion plus at one point after the IPO. And so of course that has been most likely corrected to a good extent. And of course it's also being depressed just because of the general macro cycle on the market, which is fine. We'll have some of that, but definitely the actual, I think what really matters is not the valuations, but more the results of the companies, especially in clinical trials, and also in discovery, and generally the progress of the pipelines of these companies. And those of course have seen some promising results, some good phase fund stuff.
They have a phase 2B results now, I think. First efficacy data is coming out.
Some efficacy data. Of course, I think especially within Silicon Recursion, they have reported recent efficacy data, and sort of you can read into that whatever you wish, because they want to put a silver lining on that, but it's not yet sort of compelling enough. But of course, also we have to keep in mind that the drug discovery programs that are in the clinical trials of these companies now really came from almost their very first sets of ideas, right? All those years ago when they started out, they made some bets, they chose some programs. I believe the front-running program of Recursion is the one that actually Chris Gibson's PhD was about, to a great extent, yeah. So it was a repurposing opportunity he identified during his PhD work, as far as I know. And so, clearly, Chris is a wonderful scientist and a brilliant entrepreneur, but the idea that he had during his PhD may not be the ultimate output of Recursion. So even though there are some setbacks, clearly there's more promising stuff earlier in their pipelines, and we'll have to wait for that. But I think also the setbacks do sort of are a warning sign, or a cautionary sign that we have to be mindful of what will come down the pipe later.
I like that also of what's coming from a platform. I think it's very similar in the biotech, with a biological platform where usually your first product ID is usually not the best.
It's more like a POC usually, right? You want to show that this thing even makes sense, and you can get a drug, out of it, or a drug candidate or a drug-like molecule out of it. And then, of course, you spend more time developing something that is really, really meaningful.
That's good, yeah. And transition, a very connected topic as well is, and I think what's interesting with you guys is that you have your own platform, the R&D platform, but you are more open than, let's say, Recursion, which they have their own platform, but it's only for their own internal pipelines. So can you talk a bit about this, of the difference of models, why you went to that? Yeah,
sure. I think it's been a debate, and it's still an ongoing debate, very much so in the field. So again, when the field started out, again, mid-2010s, late 2010s, initially most everybody came in almost like from a tech angle. Everybody said to investors, okay, I'll scale drug discovery to sort of to the heavens in a way. I mean, I'll run 100 programs for every program that pharma can run. I'll do something in days that they can do in years. So those claims were very much
the pitch of like, oh, it's 2 billion to develop a drug, so we will cut it down by X%. And
Exactly. We'll do it for 100 million or like 10 million, whatever. So there were very aggressive claims about scalability, and those also led to, again, the valuations, the tech angles, etc. And in a way, I think also because tech investors invested in the space, they kind of thought, okay, how are we going to make these companies extremely scalable, like a B2B tech startup? And the business model for that, of course, is to service companies and large enterprises, which are big pharma in our space. And so most everybody started working with big pharma with the hope that, okay, they'll just pay me well for my cool AI technology. And what everybody found in the early years was that pharma itself was just very much warming up to the idea that AI could be a thing that applies more widely across its processes. And so almost nobody in biopharma was really willing to pay significant amounts to access technology early on. And also, of course, a lot of the technologies out there in the AI field in the late 2010s were not really validated. I mean, maybe you had some in vitro data to back up your claims, but nobody had more advanced programs, let alone clinical trial data. And so that was like a catch-22 of, okay, I need to sell to biopharma, but I don't have validation that shows that my cool AI gizmo will give them something really meaningful that translates better to patients than what they already have. And so they're not really going to pay me, and now my business model doesn't work. So that was definitely the thing that happened early on. And so these learnings actually led to almost everybody essentially questioning, okay, what is the right business model? Do I really want to sell to these guys that are not really willing to pay me enough for my technology? And then that turned into the massive shift of the AI field towards mostly developing pharmaceutical products, essentially, because clearly everybody understood, okay, value accrues to the assets. And so if my technology, my platform gets you, essentially new assets, or I develop new assets myself, then of course pharma will pay me whatever they pay for the others in the field, because they will not be buying unvalidated technology. They'll be buying certain stage assets. Yeah. And that looked like a cool shift that made a perfect sense to everybody at the time. But of course, I'm pretty sure that a lot of us, actually, like ourselves included, really definitely underestimated the complexity of the actual drug discovery and development process and the insane number of things that can go wrong or delay you. And so if you really look at the front runners, really the most successful companies today, the Recursions, Accentias, Benevolence, and I'm saying success not in the sense that they've delivered on their promises, but in the sense that how much they raise, for example. Like, you could take that it's a super bad proxy, but it's a good proxy of how excited everybody was about the technology. And so if you look at the companies that raised the most, they really mostly went into the drug discovery direction, and then ended up not really being able to deliver on those massive promises of massive pipelines, hundreds of programs or dozens of programs. And however, it's clear that some of them were smarter / also potentially to some extent luckier, but definitely overall I think smarter as well in how they played it, because the ones that raised a lot but didn't really put enough of it towards actual drug discovery and development to have a wide enough pipeline and enough shots on goal to kind of get a chance to really get some successes in the clinic, those are the ones that are really struggling now. Like Benevolent, of course, it was a super, super, super cool company, and a really, front-running, pioneering company in the EU or in the UK, of course. But they sort of did a whole bunch of development or like discovery. They tried to figure out what they wanted to do. They likely went too broad at one point, had to cut back significantly, and that ended up with a very, very few advanced stage assets. No. And then what happens to any biotech platform, it happened to them as well. They essentially became slaves to the most advanced assets they have, And as soon as they had a setback in the clinic, now everything is falling apart to some extent, or everything is a bit wonky over there. And so, clearly looking back, 2020 hindsight allows me to say this stuff. Of course, when you were there, the decisions they made much more sense. But if you look at Recursion, I think as really the best example here, they were able to raise so much over the years, and they committed enough of it to drug discovery, to an actual pipeline build, that now, especially after the Accenture merger, they'll have so many shots on goal, so many stuff in the clinic, so many readouts. I think over like 10 or even 20 readouts coming in the next sort of 18 months, I think is what Chris mentioned recently. So with all of those shots on goal, they're likely going to get a few of them right? Even if they just hit the industry standard success rate, and then of course they'll have some validation. They'll be able to, sort of pull through. And I think ultimately what that means is that the business model of becoming a biotech is viable, but you either have to raise enough to really make it a portfolio play and have a reasonable chance of success, or you need to do insanely good drug discovery, just as any other biotech platform, to be able to succeed. And that is a viable route, but essentially it really makes your company, again, sort of completely subject to a lot of risks that your core platform has nothing to do with, right? It cannot help you really control all of the risks. Maybe it helps you be faster in drug discovery, come up with a new molecule. Maybe in our case, for example, it helps you predict biology a bit better, find something out that others couldn't. But none of these platforms can fully de-risk the drug discovery process. And so ultimately, if you go the biotech route, you have to manage risks that are far outside of your platform. And ultimately, as the field was learning about this, we just felt so strongly that this really means that if our mission or our vision as founders is to build the best simulation of biology, which is, our shtick, then we have to fully commit to that, and we have to find a way to make a business model that focuses on making that technology available to the industry versus becoming a biotech that, again, has all the risks that I mentioned already.
Yeah, makes sense. And that's, I remember when we talked, when was it, 2018, 2019, I think I made an intro to you to biotech VC, and you were more on the developing assets.
Absolutely.
And now much more on the open platform.
Yeah, we've definitely done our share. So I will say this, right? Just to be completely transparent, that it's not like we always knew. Like when we started, spinning out of our Hungarian university, we started with the vision that we have today, but that vision was, let's build the best computational simulation of biology, because if you have a simulation of biology, surely that will help you run better experiments at certain stages of the process. That was the initial vision. That's still the vision today. But in terms of what the business model is, early on, we also thought, okay, we're going to sell this to biopharma. Why not? That's going to be the right play. And then we also found, well, the simulations are not really validated enough at their initial stage to really command enough of a price from the pharma world. And so then we said, okay, well, this biotech business model sounds better and better. And so we tried to go for that. And we actually did, I think, in a way, we made the right bet, because we said, we'll develop a very targeted pipeline to demonstrate the simulations capabilities in finding novel targets in high unmet need patient populations, underrepresented patients. When you look at how well represented a certain patient population is in the available biological models, we said, well, let's show that simulations are not just a point solution. So you can not just find a target in a simulation, but you can also use it every time you run an experiment to sort of increase the chance that you run the right experiment to guide your program. And we did these two major things in our own pipeline build, and that generated plenty of in vitro and in vivo proof points, lots of good benchmarks that we today can use to actually convince biopharma much better than if we haven't done it. But we did, as you say, definitely sort of court that biotech business model at the time. But luckily then the stock markets collapsed end of 2021, and just when I was ready to kick off my Series A, we had to completely rethink everything, which I think ultimately likely benefited the company. But it was a learning journey, as you say.
Yeah. And can you talk about today, about the platform, about the offering, about who is the main benefactors?
Sure. Yeah. So as I said, really the idea is that we've developed a computational simulation of human cells and tissue, and we use machine learning to learn certain parameters about how proteins and other molecules that act on proteins interact, and how all of these interactions, molecular interactions, sort of overall drive cellular decision making. And that's what we essentially use machine learning to do. And that allows us to predict an experiment we have never run yet. Essentially, that's the core idea, that a simulation can predict something that is outside of the training set. So there's no clear data point in the training set that we use that actually allows us to predict something, but we can still do it because of the way we've architected the system. Because of that, the simulations allow us to predict experiments at the earliest stages of drug discovery. So when you're looking at, finding novel targets, but even just trying to assess which is the right target to select and invest in, we use simulations to then help select the right indication for a therapeutic program. We can use simulations to identify potential biomarkers, design the right combinations, and even select the right molecule out of a potentially super large, millions set of molecules. And at each of these stages, really ultimately, what the simulations do are essentially just provide a means for scientists to test ideas before they have to actually commit to the experiment. And if you think about it, in any engineering discipline, that's actually what people do, right? Clearly, an engineer or designer doesn't actually build a small version of a car or a jet engine or whatever before they actually pick the right design and tinker with it. They do a lot of the iteration in computational simulations, and that's what we believed back in 2015 when we spun out of university, that we had a way to build. And we were also quite convinced that eventually the field has to develop this, because of course today we don't have such simulations because we do not understand the underlying systems of our, guiding our biological behavior and decision making on the cellular level, let alone on the tissue or the organ or the body level. But if we had such a simulation, of course it would allow us to just come up with better ideas, hopefully, and get through the process faster and in a more informed fashion. So ideally, ultimately, your chance of success also grows.
Yeah, okay. And then now you're on a partnering model, or I've seen you have a lot of partners, so, and across different stages. So can you talk a bit on, I've seen you've recently reached some milestone was Ono, I think Ono.
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe can you start talking about this one?
Sure, absolutely. So what we are currently showing in the current partnerships and what's sort of our focus for the next 18 months really is to demonstrate simulations in a variety of different use cases and show that the same underlying technology, the same underlying model of cellular biology can be applied across all of these different problems. As you mentioned, we have an ongoing collaboration with Ono Pharmaceutical on essentially identifying targets in a very complex biological mechanism, which has all the hallmarks of like being a perfect fit to simulations, because it's a very complex mechanism with potentially any human gene or any human protein being a target for patients with this specific sort of subtype of cancer. But there's no way for you to actually run all of the experiments to really test all the targets in all the various subtypes of patients where this particular mechanism plays a role. And you can do this in simulations, and that's what we've done, about 350 million simulated experiments to actually test almost fully the combination of patient subtypes or cells representing patient subtypes and the potential targets. And we were able to then not just provide a ridiculously long list of ideas to the partner, because of course that's not helpful from the discovery perspective. Coming up with even more ideas doesn't really help scientists, right, who often have enough as they are. It's more about once you run the simulations and test all the potential hypotheses that you want to look into, you can actually, in the simulations or using the simulation data, you can really try to understand what went on in each of those experiments, and the ones that you found the most interesting can be really deconvoluted and analyzed almost as if you had run a real experiment, and actually to an even greater degree, because a simulation is of course perfectly known in the computational, in the cloud setup that we have. So you know everything about the cell that you simulate. And of course, you can never know everything about even a cell that you experiment on. And so we know what happens to each and every protein in our simulation. We know how each and every protein and their interactions and other molecules that act on them respond to a treatment by a drug, or the knockout of a certain target, or the modulation of a certain sort of interaction between two proteins. And so a biologist who uses our digital lab can, once they run the simulations, look at every one of the interesting experiments and really try to understand what went on in there. And that mechanistic understanding is extremely key if you're a biologist, a translational scientist, or anybody that does work in drug discovery, because of course, lots of things, look interesting in a cell. Like lots of things kill a cell, lots of things help mice with a xenograft. But most of these things, of course, in the end, do not really help the actual human patients that we try to help. And oftentimes, the reason for that is because, let's say, a drug killed a cell through a mechanism that actually doesn't occur in a patient. Yeah. But because you only saw that the cell's viability decreased.
Reminds you about
exactly.
You can cure cancer in a petri dish.
Exactly. And so the problem is that if you don't know why something occurred, especially in a simulation, which is of course not even a real biological experiment, it's just a simulation, just a model, an even greater abstraction than even an in vitro petri dish, like a in vitro model in a petri dish. Because of that, you really need to understand why something occurs so that you can take that information and then design the right experiment to confirm it. And that's something we've spent an insane amount of time working on to make the model interpretable to a trained biologist, so they can glean new mechanistic insights or glean new ideas about biology and biological mechanisms from these simulations, and then they can take that to an experiment and confirm it directly. So essentially, they know everything they need to know about the assay that they need to run, the experiment, the perturbation, the model that they need to pick in an in vitro or in vivo, or potentially even in a patient setting. And that information helps them to take lots of ideas that come out of a simulation or ideas that they may have already had, and actually prioritize and select a feasible number to then experiment on much better than if they didn't, or if they haven't run simulations. And so that's actually one of the key benefits. It's not just finding new stuff, like in the Ono collaboration, new targets. It's more about, it's just as importantly, the fact that we can provide an interpretable hypothesis that can be sort of derived from the simulations and observing them.
And at the end of the day, if you're improving or like boiling down or reducing the number of experiments or the number of ideas, you're also making the whole drug discovery faster, I guess, for the partner.
Yeah, you would assume that really three things happen ultimately. One is that you do reduce the number of experiments, and that has a time component or a time benefit, right? Hopefully you run fewer experiments, maybe fewer iterations of the experiment, and that can cut down on the time. Of course, you always have to keep in mind that adding any technology to a process means that you're adding a new step, and that does take time, right? Even though we've optimized our simulations to be really fast, so you can be sort of up and running in like as little as 3 months, essentially, you can get a new model trained and specific insight into your problem. We can do that. But even though that's initial 3 months, so that has to be kept in mind. But I think over like a couple of steps of the drug discovery process, you're likely going to cut down time as well. You're clearly cutting costs because fewer iterations, especially with certain experiments, it can be very costly. And we do hope that ultimately it does benefit the probability of success, not for any magical reasons of the AI, but I think more because with the simulations, actually, we've routinely found in our own drug discovery work and also in partners that if you have this level of insight into the biology, or at least predictions on it, that actually sometimes reveals or opens up new questions or new lines of inquiry. It tells you more about really what is the right type of patient. You are really more thoughtful about how you pick the models that you test your drugs on, what that means for the patient selection, the clinical trial design, combination potential. And so this kind of insight we've seen actually helps you better prepare essentially your data package for the IND and hopefully better prepare your discovery effort for the trials. And I think that ultimately does have a real impact on the likelihood of success.
That's good. And you mentioned before on the pricing that was one of the challenge was to price the technology.
Yeah.
How does it look like now that you have more
information, more partnerships?
A bit more, and you have a bit. Sounds like your whole platform is a bit more proven as well.
Oh yeah,
it was in 2018.
I would hope so. Yes, but for sure, we have many more like novel targets, biomarkers, combinations that we've identified and have been validated in various stages of drug discovery. So for surely more validated. The validation definitely helps. I mean, what we've shown, for example, in the collaboration with Ono and in some of the other work that we've announced, for example, with AstraZeneca, is that the simulations are seen as a much more likely source of new IP than before. Yeah. So there's, the more standard components of pricing, like milestones, for example, for success. But really what we're working on now and the new collaborations that we're spinning up are following this format is that we actually don't want to make simulations and partnering with us such a pricey thing for pharma that, only the biggest companies can afford it. Or we're one of the very few bets that a large pharmaceutical makes on AI for a very simple reason, because we think that we're best used not as a particular partner to solve one specific problem. So, find me targets in this difficult area, or, take my drug and give me one specific biomarker for the drug. We think we're much more of a capability to a biopharma, and we're best used like all the time, essentially. So if you say, okay, here's my program, it's preclinical, I really want to know which indication to go for, which patient subtype, which drugs to combine with potentially, what's my likely combination effect with standard of care, etc. We can provide simulations essentially to answer all of those questions, help you run the actual experiments to confirm them. And then once you've done that, you're going to enter the next phase of your drug discovery or development effort, and you'll have even more questions as always, right? You'll learn more stuff, you'll see responses that you didn't expect, especially in the trials. And those questions should be plugged back into a simulation. New simulations should be launched to answer those questions. Why are certain patients responding? Why are the others not? What could be the differentiating biomarker or pattern between those two? For example, how do I expand beyond my initial indication where I've shown efficacy? These questions can also be answered and have been actually by various pharma companies using simulations. And we really want to become essentially, I don't like to use this word, but you could say like a co-pilot for the programs, right?
On each different steps.
Essentially, the simulations can be there. And this is also helped by the simple fact that simulations do get better every time you predict and then validate a simulation result, because the data that's generated in the ensuing validation experiment can be fed back into the simulations training set. And we've shown this with our own lab, where we've sort of closed this loop, lab in the loop, quote unquote, around the simulations that you predict, you validate, and then the data, if you run the right assay, and we've learned a lot about what is the right assay over the years, then that data can be fed back to improve specifically the simulation's ability to predict around that target or that mechanism that's of interest, or in that indication, for example, or in that model that you're using. And that improvement compounds over time, and of course should benefit you more and more as you, with your drug discovery program, go from in vitro to in vivo to patient.
Okay, and picking on what you just said, also you want to be accessible to, let's say, a lot of partners versus trying to optimize the biggest upfront possible, I guess. So, I guess what's coming down also, and that's the power of AI or digital simulations, that you could scale it more than a biology.
It's essentially, absolutely. Ultimately, the simulations, the digital lab is, it runs on the cloud, right? Running on Microsoft's Azure, and also to some extent likely now on Amazon's AWS. And what essentially you get when you, or what happens when you run a simulated experiment at partner 1 or partner 2 is essentially just more essentially more cloud capacity being spun up to help answer that question. So ultimately, it's infinitely more scalable than any wet lab, as you say. And that's one of the key benefits as well. If you think about it, again, I mentioned 350 million experiments for Ono, and that experiment actually took us, let's say, a week essentially to run, less than a week. And training the model, getting the right data in, etc. That was actually almost the biggest amount of time to make sure that we're predictive on what matters. So as our model's predictivity improves over time and it becomes more and more predictive on more and more biological mechanisms, and then hopefully also beyond cancer cells in other disease areas and more complex sort of tissue level effects, our plan is to have essentially a single model serving all of the various partnerships. And that should allow us to make it very, very quick to get started and to get an answer. No sort of weeks or months needed to set up. You're essentially using the best version of the simulated cells, simulated tissue that we can provide today. And we're just a standard part of your practice. As you sort of think about the right experiment to run, the right way to take a program, you're always sort of running a few simulations, playing around with ideas, and then you know which experiment to actually invest months and hundreds of thousands into.
Yeah, okay. That sounds good. And I've seen you're also active in you have models for ADCs, which is a super hot field at the moment, especially in biotech. How specifically do you how do you specifically are you active in this field, or
good question.
What do you bring here?
Good question. When the immuno-oncology wave sort of hit us all those years ago, we were very, very early on, and so we could not really build simulations that were predictive of such a complex mechanism, and that was sort of a huge opportunity missed in a way. But now with, of course, the ADC wave, sort of rolling everybody over, we're actually with this much more mature platform, we've shown that we can predict a number of things that are sort of thorns in the side of a lot of the pharma companies developing ADC platforms or ADC programs, because obviously ultimately, ADCs, again, are a really good fit for simulations for a simple reason. There's all of these moving pieces. What is your payload? What is your linker? What is your antibody? What target do you hit? In what tissue? Are you looking for a biomarker, etc.? All of these together make up a too complex problem to try to experimentally really deconvolute. And so, of course, without the simulation, you do end up cutting corners. You do have to make assumptions, sort of lean on the best information that's available publicly, etc. Whereas in the simulations, what you can do is sort of test all the potential targets in all the potential biological contexts, test all the various payloads that you're sort of thinking about in all of these contexts, and then run that whole search screen, the full grid, essentially. And the benefit of that is that, we don't want to help you design a better linker, for example. We don't think that that's the simulation's value add here. But what we can tell you is what is the right payload, for example, in what patient type to go for. How do you maybe want to cycle payloads one after the other? How do you overcome resistance that's been observed in the clinic for the more, front-running TROP2, etc. ADCs? How do you build the next generation of the ADCs, and how do you expand the more advanced ADC programs beyond those initial sort of beachheads where they've been successful? What could be a good biomarker, for example, to use to select patients if you're not succeeding with more like an all-comer approach, or not all-comer, but of course you're more going for some target expression. It's like, what's the biomarker beyond the target expression? These are all clearly questions that the ADC field needs to struggle with or grapple with, because they're leading to sort of patient benefit being left on the table and trial failures. And this is something that we've now really put a lot of effort into generating targeted data sets to help train our simulated cells to better predict ADC effects and payload effects, and helping then essentially find the right payload, subtype, target combinations, essentially.
Yeah. And ADCs, there's some big pharma. There's definitely some big pharma active in the field, but you have also a lot of biotechs or smaller companies.
Yes.
So how do you work with let's say ADCs or even beyond ADCs, how do you work with smaller biotech that has raised let's say the average European biotech has raised 50 million, has maybe a program or early stage program in ADCs. How do you work with them?
This comes back to the question about pricing that you mentioned. And I mentioned that what we really want to do is find a way to work with any company. Because again, if we want to go for a business model that focuses on partnering and making this technology available essentially to others and being valued for the utilization and revenue derived from this technology, then we have to find a way to go beyond the biggest 10, 20 pharma companies, because that is not a scalable business model. And for that reason, we're working a lot on developing a generally predictive model of cancer types and certain cell types and certain tissues, because we believe that if we have a well-performing model that doesn't have to be fine-tuned, we don't have to generate more training data, for example, for it, then we can make that accessible for somebody that's a company that's much smaller to run simulations on without them having to actually pay us to generate even more training data and fine-tune the model, which is actually the costliest part. It's not the simulations, it's more the data generation in a very targeted fashion, and also the training of the models that takes up most of our compute resources. And then, of course, interpretation. When our trained biologists and translational scientists work with the other team on the pharma side to help them understand simulations and help them derive hypotheses. And if we can develop in a way that sort of strips out a lot of these resources from an interaction with a small biotech that really wants an answer to a very specific question or wants to just support with simulations a single program, then we can make it available at a price that's sort of feasible to pay, because it's a technology and a capability, and you're getting your money back because you're cutting time, iteration, and failure out of your process.
That's good. And that's you already at that stage now where you have a general model.
We're talking. Yes. And so something that I didn't mention, but just as a sort of an interesting data point, really when we started, we sort of set some foundational rules for how we develop our technology. And one of those rules was, if we want to predict cells in the more complex biology, we need to build a model that is a singular model underlying every different cell model that we have, for example. There's a simple reason for that. Ultimately, if you think about it, human biology has a set of foundational rules that really guides how it behaves and how it makes decisions and how it reacts to outside stimuli. And clearly, a healthy lung cell is very different from a colorectal cancer cell of a certain patient. But we believe that there's a foundational set of sort of rules and guideposts that you can figure out that help you then create from a singular representation of biology a model that predicts on the cancer cell and also a model that predicts on the healthy cell. And we think that that has to do with, again, how proteins interact and how other molecules act on proteins. And essentially learning that foundational wiring diagram is what we call it, allows us already actually to take one basic trained model and add specific data coming from a certain cancer cell type, coming from a certain cell line, or coming from a patient's tumor, and then have differential behavior and accurate behavior when simulating the effects of drugs or knockouts on these different models. So we already have that, and of course it's a work in progress. Current model has about 8,500 proteins and their various interactions and various effects acting on them in it, and we've shown that it's predictive on the cancer cell level, and we're going to go beyond cancer cells now. We've shown some predictivity in immune cells as well, but it's very much sort of a long roadmap that we have to continue to travel on. So it's not done for sure.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. And maybe now stepping down back to the history of the company. I mean, you mentioned a bit you sped out from the university, which I think I've seen the building like on the
right around the corner. Yeah,
at the corner. Really cool building, actually. Can you talk a bit on the history from there to now? I know you went through Berlin and through the BioGrant Labs. That's where we met. And Yeah, can you walk through the main steps of the history of the company?
Sure. So as you say, it all actually, funnily enough, started right around the corner at Semmelweis University, where two of my co-founders, Donny and Krish, were CSO and CTO, respectively. They were collaborating to essentially build the very foundations, the seeds of the simulated cell. Like one of them is an electrical engineer, software engineer, math whiz turned biochemist, and the other is a medical doctor that wanted to, find a more rational way of treating and diagnosing disease. And they essentially put two and two together during the PhD work and figured out that you can represent cellular biology as a network that can be simulated, and eventually also figured out how machine learning can be used to train and parameterize and then grow and expand this network. And we took this, I essentially came along to help catalyze the spin out. Funnily enough, I had nothing to do with anything that we essentially work in. I had nothing to do with oncology, drug discovery, let alone AI. But I did actually have some experience spinning out cool IP in cybersecurity, actually, from university and making that successful. And I wanted to recreate that. I wanted to do that, but in a more meaningful field. And of course, that meant years of learning for all of us. I mean, for me, about everything, essentially, to be even remotely useful. But for the guys also, there had to be a lot of learning done to better understand ultimately the problems that we could use with this cool technology, because we were very much a science-first team where, really cool idea, cool early results, but what is really the problem that you're solving and what is the product? And that's something that I hope I helped figure out just based on my previous experience doing this in a different field. And what really catalyzed us was the ability to work with Bayer very closely during, as you said, the Grants for Apps programs that he used to, run at that time. Shout out to the entire team, because of course they really transformed us, because they gave us a chance to sort of roam around Bayer HQ, talk to everybody from the C-level down to bench scientists. And that really revealed some of the core use cases where running experiments based off of the best knowledge of a trained scientist falls short, where just too many experiments need to be run to really understand what's going on. And we started developing simulations to help tackle those core use cases around identifying biomarkers, overcoming resistance, designing combinations, and understanding mechanism. So these were very early inputs, and they allowed us to really develop the simulations in a direction that actually is useful and can be deployed sort of in the day-to-day life of a drug discovery scientist, because we wanted to make sure that very early on we don't spend 10 years raise tens of millions and not really have anything that's impactful. So that's what we focused on for first years. And then around 2020, 2021 is when we started fundraising, when we had enough data from the early pharma collaborations that we were predictive and were finding interesting things and actually impacting decisions across the R&D process. And as you mentioned earlier, we then in a very targeted fashion validated core simulation use cases and solutions we have, and in our own drug discovery work. And then we raised our Series A about 2 years ago from Merck and a couple others, Merck US, to actually really start commercializing essentially the simulations.
That's nice. And I saw you raised, or Accenture invested, I think it was in May or...
Yeah. So we joined forces with a couple new companies and sort of struck some interesting partnerships, and we're doing some more now. We hope to announce some of that in the next quarter, because one of the key questions around how do you get simulation into the sort of day-to-day life of scientists that have never used such a technology and just do not run their process, do not work like this yet, is of course who talks to those scientists, who talks to maybe the leaders at those companies all the time, and who helps sell technology to these types of enterprises and companies. And companies like Accenture seem to be sort of out of left field collaboration. But of course, Accenture is one of the most successful companies on the earth this century, selling technology to pharma. They definitely,
I know them more for IT.
Fair point. I wanted to say, actually, can they sell to R&D? That remains to be seen. That's definitely a work in progress even on their end. But I think what their focus on our field reveals is that if you really think about it, pharma R&D does not yet really know how to buy technology, which you can completely understand because people in R&D are extremely smart, really good scientists, really good decision makers, and they know how to partner around therapeutics. Yeah. But some of these new technologies clearly sort of stretch the boundaries of how they used to value things that they get from partners. And as we said, first generation of drug discovery or AI drug discovery companies clearly went to a business model that fits the way the industry works. But I think us and a lot of others that are, sort of the next wave of technologies, hopefully we can start shifting the way that pharma views and biotech views technology and how they value it. And that starts with learning how to sell technology and educating our sort of buyers essentially on how to buy technology in R&D as well. And companies like Accenture are also trying to figure that out because, as you say, it's not IT, that's going to buy an AI technology to make better decisions in drug discovery and development. But clearly somebody will need to sort of figure out how to do it on the inside of these companies. And partnering with much larger enterprises than us that sell to these sort of end users routinely helps us also learn how to do it better, and also hopefully get to more entities and maybe be more integrated into their workflows and other technologies that they purchase.
Okay. Yeah, so for Accenture, it's a step to see AI drug discovery or any kind of digital tool for drug discovery.
Absolutely.
As in
if you really think
of IT.
If you think about it, what they're trying to do is, and of course many others, McKinsey and the others are also doing this. They're trying to figure out how do we sell to essentially a new budget, a new type of customer. But for doing that, or in order to do that, it's not enough that they're extremely competent at the basic computational technologies of our time, like cloud and AI and Gen AI. That's not enough because they need to also be domain experts. And that's what we and a bunch of others provide that are now sort of strategic partners over there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And one, I think, more personal question, but you're living here in Budapest, and then I see that you're traveling a lot to either European hubs, either Boston. How do you prioritize? Yeah, how do you prioritize all of this traveling?
Yeah, I also have a small daughter now, so I also need to be dedicating enough time there. It's a good question. I think it's also clearly that I will say that I don't think we've sort of proven that it can work like this, right? That you don't have to move to the UK or to Boston to build a successful, AI and biotech company. I think we're putting in a good case, but I think what I miss the most is just the gossip, essentially, around the field. Just more information about what people are trying, what doesn't work, what works,
what's going on,
who's looking for what, who's interested in what. That's clearly the most useful information as you think about business models, as you think about strategy, as you think about BD. This information is what you're missing the most, and we've sort of found workarounds for that. Essentially, we've built a really strong board, really strong SAB, not just strong in the sense that it's really good and smart and validated and credible people on there. It's more about having very strong personal relationships with them that I think helped us individually actually to try to sort of stopgap that, or try to learn the information that I would learn likely sort of day in and day out if I lived somewhere else. Yeah. Of course,
to compensate.
It's essentially you can compensate. You do have to take a bit more travel, but I think it's more about trying to do enough travel to get this type of information. And the reason that we stayed home was because I think sort of two reasons. One is, of course, there's clearly sort of operational advantages to running such a company out of the Central Eastern Europe versus even the UK, let alone the US. Clearly cost advantages, and you're also being able to tap into really good talent, especially on the computational and AI side, but also actually on the biology side, and talent that doesn't really have sort of anybody that competes for its attention if they want to work on some really cool problems around drug discovery and AI and in biology, because we're really almost the sole sort of more advanced or sort of scale up phase company in this region. And so we get to really take the cream of the crop. That definitely helps. But the other advantage is that, or the other reason we stayed home is because we just wanted to do something good for our ecosystem. And of course, when people usually hear Hungary, I don't think they hear it in a very positive context. And, clearly there's not just us, but a lot of others that do good stuff, good work here, that don't agree with the politics, but want to still do something good for our country and, the region more widely. And clearly, if we moved somewhere else, we may have an easier time of doing certain things. But I think being here allows us to have a different view on a lot of problems, maybe think about things sometimes in a bit different way that gives you a competitive advantage. And also hopefully pull others with us and, give a better shot at the next generation of, let's say, tech bio companies coming out of the region.
Yeah. I mean, you did pretty well so far.
Well, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed for the next steps. Yeah. Maybe last question before the Quickfire is on. I had Thomas Klosel from Orkin on the show. And,
I saw.
And one thing that he mentioned pretty clearly at the beginning was that the industry needs to be more data-driven versus gut feeling.
Anecdotal, yeah.
I guess you must agree on this, but maybe what's your take there? What's your view there?
I think actually it's funnily enough ties to how pharma needs to eventually learn to value technology and technologies like ours, because I think currently people are AI is useful if it gives me a new drug or new IP of certain sort, and a lot of these technologies, us included, can provide that. But I think ultimately the bigger impact of AI will not be necessarily just a new IP; it will more be the better decisions, and as Thomas said,
better IP,
better IP. Yeah, in a way, I think the more systematic approach to drug discovery, just because you're not limited to the number of experiments you can run at any stage. You're limited to the number of ideas you can have, essentially, and you can find the right experiment to run more in a higher chance or with a higher chance. I think that more systematic versus more anecdotal approach will really be ultimately the bigger impact. And I think already today that's the bigger impact AI has on the field, under the hype.
Yeah.
And if you think about it. What we usually say is that we want to turn biology into an engineering discipline, but I think this applies more broadly to human health, right? Of course, this is not going to happen tomorrow, and we ourselves are not the sole solution, and we ourselves will likely make we hope a small but overall significant dent in the overall problem. But if we don't invest into these technologies today, if we don't test them, if we don't learn how to use them to make better decisions, then ultimately the field is not going to be sustainable, as we know. It is not going to go ahead and move forward. So clearly we have to make these bets if we are to turn, biology and broadly health into engineering.
Yeah.
In the best possible way.
Yeah.
Not to take out the human touch, but to actually help put that into health.
And do you see some actors that are better students in the quote? I mean, just better at being data-driven, some farmers that are more active, more embracing it. I mean,
clearly Roche/Genentech, made the massive bet with Aviv, being named head of R&D, and clearly a lot of them are investing into.
Was about
AI, right?
Genentech,
But I think not just saying I really name a CIO, or of course it's not usually not a CIO, but it's not just that I have a strong data science/AI group within my teams, but it's that really somebody that bridges biology, drug discovery, and AI is the head of R&D for me. That is a huge sort of step forward and a big bet for sure. We've had really good. I'm not just saying this because we do collaborate with them, but I think AstraZeneca is very knowledgeable and actually has deployed various data science and machine learning technologies to real problems that they have.
Yeah.
So they've really invested there. Clearly Sanofi, of course,
I was about to say,
is going all out. And I think the Sanofi actually does a really good thing for definitely the French ecosystem.
Is it PR or how much of it is PR versus?
But
I think they put really hundreds of millions.
Yeah,
in it.
I think that I'm sure that it's PR to some extent.
Yeah.
But I will say, I think actually that's exactly what this field and these applications need, because they need somebody saying, listen, look at all this money I put into this particular technology. I A, made a bet, B, gave this company a chance to actually progress, C, I'm talking very openly about it. So actually that tells everybody else that they should be thinking about making these bets. So I think Sanofi really does actually do a good work across the field for just sort of advertising the use of AI. Better like how impactful it is day to day, I wouldn't be able to tell, but my assumption is
If you work with them soon, maybe.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, we have to get our game up beyond oncology for that, most likely.
Cool. I think it's a good way to wrap up and to finish on the quick fire. So quick questions. You answer one sentence or yes or no. First one, what's on the top of your mind at the moment?
Yes or no? Yes.
What? One sentence.
One sentence, top of mind for me. Essentially, pricing model. How do we get simulations in the door at a pharma and then convince them that they should use simulations over time, multiple times?
What's one of your favorite biotech books?
The $1 Billion Molecule.
Biotech, the Biotech story, yeah.
I think it reveals how crazy this industry has always been in terms of its approach, and how much is just sort of luck plus capable people like giving it their all.
Yeah, and how much you need to sell your story.
Yeah.
If I remember
Actually,
one of
fair
the thing
point.
from this book, right?
Yeah, how much selling matters. Fair point.
Even when you one mistake you made in the past 12 months.
One mistake. Not fixing my sleep schedule before baby Maya's arrival. I don't have a chance anymore.
No, I was about to how much do you sleep per night? But I guess it was a bit.
But actually, I'm up to 6.5 hours, which is, I think, historically okay for me.
You're still functional.
Yeah.
What's the most impressive drug on the market at the moment to you?
Most of all, you have to say Keytruda for sure. I think just the story of how it got to where it got to, and also the approach of then like making it essentially a standard part of any trial. I think, kudos to Merck.
Yeah. And 25 billion
Yeah.
annual sales or something.
Yeah.
Insane. One of your favorite European biotechs?
Favorite European biotech?
Biotech company.
I think BioNTech. BioNTech for sure. Just because the founders also do a lot to give back to the industry and invest more.
Nice. We had I just talked last week with the former CBO, so this episode will come out. And I think they do a lot on AI as well.
Yeah.
Last question. One of your biotech heroes, European or not European?
Biotech heroes. I think I will say Aviv Regev, for the simple reason that I'm really interested in seeing the outcome of that experiment at Genentech. I think she's making a lot of bets around implementing AI into some of the things that we also want to implement it, but also of course others are working on, and I hope that they share more about their learnings.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Great chat.
Great fun. Yeah. Thank you. I'm convinced that AI and machine learning will change drug development and that simulation will be a big part of it. I'm also impressed by what Szabi and his team was able to build, especially out of Budapest. If you also enjoyed this episode, please hit the like, follow, review button. Any of these actions would help a lot to give more people access to the show. If you want to see similar videos, please feel free to check the channel where we have many more. I would also be curious to hear what you think. So please leave a comment below or send me an email at Philip at Flot.bio. All right. Thanks for staying until the end and see you in the next episode.